Dear colleagues, welcome to our monthly dialogue. Probably you remember that dialogue is a Greek word, and Socrates believed that a dialogue is a way to reach the truth. Today I'm in Athens, and from my hotel I can see the Acropolis. Acropolis is a wonderful view, and it is impressive to think that more than 2,000 years ago, these remarkable Greek philosophers started philosophy and started a new way for human kind of thinking. Now, today, the dialogue, I remind you, dialogue live streamed in YouTube and in Twitter. Now it's called X. And then they are posted in YouTube, and you can see them whenever you wish. Today, the dialogue will be, as usual, interactive. So please ask questions in your chats, and we will allow you to ask your questions. It's very interactive as usual. And now I have something very special to announce. Well, the dialogue today is remarkably important and will be remarkably interesting. I just tell you the title. The title is Endothelial Dysfunction, narrated by a Nobel Laureate. I don't say more, but I ask Lina Badimon, Executive Editor of the European Heart Journal, to introduce our important guest today. Please, Lina.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here today to have this dialogue with our invited personality, Lou Ignarro. Lou Ignarro, everybody knows Lou. And with this dialogue, we will have the opportunity of knowing him better. This is what is important. So he wrote a book last year, and he started saying, as I write this book in October of 2023, I am celebrating my 82nd birthday. At this age, I still feel great and full of energy, both physically and mentally. I attribute my health and longevity to the lifestyle I have practiced for so many years. In fact, all my life, I have practiced this way of living. It started way back as a small child, when my mom and dad routinely prepare healthy Mediterranean meals. So Dr. Ignarro is a native of Brooklyn, New York. Dr. Ignarro studied undergraduate pharmacology and pharmacy at Columbia University, there in New York City, before earning his doctorate in pharmacology at the University of Minnesota. In 1968, he completed his postdoctoral fellowship in chemical pharmacology at the National Institute of Health. Upon completing his fellowship, Dr. Ignarro was recruited by Ciba-Geigy Pharmaceuticals in New York, and he led the company's biochemical and anti-inflammatory program. His work led to the development and marketing of diclofenac, a drug that is named Voltaren, you know it, as very, very much used. In 1973, he left the drug industry to pursue a career in academia. He did a good job, huh? Both there in industry and afterwards in academia. As a professor with the Tulane University School of Medicine, Dr. Ignarro began his basic research into nitric oxide and its relationship with the cyclic nucleotide cyclic GMP. He later joined the faculty at UCLA School of Medicine in 1985 to continue his basic research on nitric oxide and cyclic GMP. In 1993, Dr. Ignarro became Distinguished Professor of Pharmacology at the UCLA, where he currently serves as Professor Emeritus in the Department of Molecular and Medical Pharmacology. At UCLA, he has excelled as both a research scientist and professor because he has been winning 11 consecutive Golden Apple Teaching Awards from his medical students. So he's doing great in an industry, in research, as a teacher. So we are really getting here a lot of information. Dr. Ignarro was awarded in 1998 the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, along with Furjgod and Farid Murad. And this is known by all people working in our area in medicine, in cardiology. And he was awarded for their discovery that the nitric oxide acts as a signaling molecule in the cardiovascular system. He discovered specifically that nitric oxide relaxes the vascular smooth muscle cells. So from this abridged vision of his career, this excellent career, I would like to initiate a dialogue that I'm sure will be a delight for our young audience, but also for the not so young, but still young audience. So I think that I like to ask you about your parents, to get to know you better. Can you tell us about your Italian roots?
Sure, Lina. It's very interesting. Both my parents were born in Italia. My father was born in a suburb of Napoli. It's called Torre del Greco, which is the city that's right at the base of Mount Vesuvius. What a beautiful city and just a beautiful view. My mother was more from the south. She was from Panarea, which is one of the Aioli Islands just north of the mainland of Sicily. And so one was from Sicily, one was from Naples. They both moved to the United States separately, and they met in Brooklyn, New York, in the Italian neighborhood. They got married, and then I came along.
Well, this is interesting. I mean, the Italian people at that time emigrated a lot to the United States, right? So
Sure.
now tell us, fireworks have been important in your life, right? Can you tell us why?
Sure. I have always been, well, my parents tell me, especially my mother, who never agreed with anything I did at home because it was too dangerous and she thought life-threatening. I was always interested in chemistry, even when I was 10 years old. Most of my friends didn't even know what the word chemistry meant. But I was interested in chemistry. They used to take us every July 4th or Independence Day in America to the beach in Long Beach, Long Island. It's close to Brooklyn. And I would watch these explosives. They were gorgeous and beautiful. And I thought, well, maybe I could do something like that in the backyard and make some firecrackers. Well, I had to buy the chemicals. So I convinced my mother and father to buy me a chemistry set. My mother was very reluctant. My father said, oh, it's okay. Let him do what he wants to do. It's okay. So I had a chemistry set, and I was able to use some of the chemicals to make firecrackers. But I needed other chemicals that were not in the chemistry set. So I was able to get my older neighbors to walk to the pharmacy to buy some of those chemicals. In those days, the pharmacy had all kinds of chemicals because they made all the prescription drugs. Today, we just get them from a pharmaceutical house, we put them in a bottle, put a label on it, and that's it. But in the olden days, you had to make it. So all the raw ingredients were there. And I must admit, I made some fairly destructive firecrackers. I remember one I lit in the basement of our home, and it was under a dresser where my mom used to store all the winter clothes. So I lit this firecracker, and it blew up the dresser into a million pieces of wood, and all the underwear was just flying all over the room. So that's when my dad decided that maybe it was not a good idea to buy the chemistry set. So I really got into this. And what's important about this, I want to mention, is that at the age of 10, 11 years old, never having taken a course in chemistry, I read lots of chemistry manuals and followed the instructions of how to mix certain chemicals together to produce something that would burn or explode or work like a rocket fuel. And I had a passion for doing this. And because of that, I never lost interest in chemistry.
That's interesting. So what shifted your interest from explosives to cardiology or to medicine?
Two things. Number one, when I was a young teenager working on gunpowder, we used gunpowder to make, we meaning I used gunpowder to make the firecrackers. But in all my reading, I came across this other explosive called nitroglycerin. And I read about it and I realized, I cannot make it. It's too difficult to make. It's way too dangerous to make. And so I decided, nah, I'm not going to try making nitroglycerin. Thank God I did not. But you see, what I noticed is that my neighbor, his name was Sam Abrams. He had heart condition. He always got chest pains, arm pains, angina pectoris. And he came home one day from the train station and he sat on the steps before he get into the house, and he's breathing heavy, suffering from pain. And his wife came running down with these tiny tablets and put a tablet under his tongue. And I'm telling you, within 2 minutes, the pains disappeared. He was able to stand up and gently, gradually walk back into the house. And so I said to his wife, her name was Anna, I said, what medication is that? And she said, nitroglycerin. And I thought, that's impossible. Nitroglycerin is an explosive, not a drug that would be used to treat an impending heart attack. And so I read more and more, and that was way before I started college. I read more and more about nitroglycerin and decided 15 years before graduate school that someday I was going to try to study the mechanism by which this explosive works as a vasodilator.
Yeah. So observation from early ages, right? So
Absolutely.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So
And I was very stubborn. I had to know the answers for everything. I used to go to bed at night. If I did not know the answer to something, I would write it down, and the next day or two, I would try to figure it out. My mind was just terrible that way.
So, and then you started to work with nitric oxide, right? When you were already graduated, years afterwards.
Yes, I did, because I followed in the footsteps of Fred Murad, who shared in the Nobel Prize. He was working on cyclic GMP as I was working on cyclic GMP.
Yeah.
And we couldn't make any progress because you cannot add cyclic GMP to cells to produce an effect, because cyclic GMP is very hydrophilic. It will not permeate membranes. Remember, cyclic GMP is an intracellular signaling molecule.
Mm-hmm.
And so we all looked for ways to increase cyclic GMP in cells so that we could determine what this increase in cyclic GMP might do in terms of a pharmacological effect. Well, Fred Murad discovered that nitric oxide, of all things, activates the enzyme G-cyclase to make cyclic GMP. And so we immediately got into that, and we started studying nitric oxide. I'm a pharmacologist. We studied the pharmacology of nitric oxide, and we found that it's a vascular smooth muscle relaxant. It's even a non-vascular smooth muscle relaxant. It relaxes airway smooth muscle. And we found that it inhibited platelet function, all by increasing cyclic GMP. So that's how we got started with
The
NO.
mechanism, right? So were you aware that you were discovering something that would get you to get the Nobel Prize when you were doing the experiments?
No. No, because when I was in graduate school, let me tell you something, Lina. The most important thing I had in my mind was to keep my job. I wanted to make tenure. It's very competitive. So I felt that I better do experiments that work, where I can have good publications and maintain my tenure so that they keep me in the university and eventually could, be a professor. So the furthest thing from my mind was winning any kind of an award, much less the Nobel Prize. Now, later in the work, yes, the idea struck me that that might be possible, and we can get to that. But here, I was just fascinated with the chemistry of how an unstable free radical gas can have these signaling properties to cause vasodilation inhibit blood clotting, improve blood flow, decrease blood pressure. This was all mind-boggling to me, and that's what I wanted to study.
Exactly. I think Filippo wants to ask you something.
Sure.
Filippo.
Well, Lou, thank you first for your participation to the dialogue, and also thank you for these initial answers, which reveals what really makes the difference. And what you told us is that the trigger in your life has been curiosity, curiosity for explosives, and then fireworks, and then also curiosity generated by something which doesn't generate question in general, to see a patient who is revived by a small pill. In your case, this is triggered again your curiosity, and this led to your subsequent discoveries. I think this is important for our young colleagues. Curiosity. If there is something which for which we do not have an answer, well, this curiosity should generate investigation. This is the example you gave us with initial answers. Do you agree on this, Lou?
Oh, yes, I agree on this wholeheartedly because, you know, in school, in training, you cannot teach curiosity. You cannot teach passion. I mean, for me, somehow it was simple. I see a little drug, a little pill, a tablet produce this dramatic relief and save this man's life within literally 2 minutes, 1 minute. And so I'm thinking nitroglycerin, nitroglycerin. At that time, I was not thinking nitric oxide. But then when I started to study nitric oxide, as we just talked about, I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, wait a second. Nitroglycerin. Look at the nitro part. I looked at the chemistry. Nitric oxide is built into the chemistry of nitroglycerin. And I'm thinking, okay, if NO is a vasodilator, my goodness, maybe nitroglycerin is metabolized to nitric oxide in the arteries. And that's why nitroglycerin is a vasodilator. And that's exactly what we found. If I was not curious, I would not have done that.
Yeah, but then Lou, there's a second element. Curiosity is the trigger, but a fertile mind is triggered by curiosity, but is not enough. Then you must elaborate. You must ask yourself the right questions, and then you reach the right answer. And this is really the difference. For a genius like you, this observation, generating in your mind the right questions, is not always the case. So curiosity is the trigger, and then you need a fertile mind which goes to the right questions to address. But
Yes.
let's come to the Nobel Prize. You received the Nobel Prize with two wonderful colleagues, Fershigot and Murad. Did you know each other before receiving the Nobel Prize?
Oh yeah, right. I knew Bob first got first because it's interesting. He was much older than the rest of us, and when I was doing my postdoc at the NIH, he invited me to come look at his laboratory to do another postdoc at Brooklyn Downstate Medical Center in New York. And I went and I looked and so on, and I was about ready to accept a position. But then drug industry got a hold of me, Filippo. They offered me a job that paid 4 times the salary. I wouldn't have to write any research grants. And I thought, well, you know, maybe I could really get a handle on running a laboratory and doing research without the bother and the trouble and the time constraints to write grants. So I accepted the job at Ciba-Geigy, which later became Novartis. But I knew Bob for a long time. We saw each other twice a year for many, many decades at pharmacology meetings. And then I knew Fred Murad, because Fred Murad was the one who discovered that nitric oxide elevates cyclic GMP. He made the discovery in 1977 when I was studying cyclic GMP, but not nitric oxide. So we met each other at a meeting, a cyclic nucleotide conference where cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP were discussed. So we spent 5 days talking and talking and talking. And from that point on, we continued to talk. We never collaborated in the laboratory. Fred Murad was a kind of a loner. He did not want to share his information with anybody. He was always afraid he would get scooped. So he kept kind of everything in secret until it was published. So he didn't want to work with me. Bob Furchgott, on the other hand, was very open and he wanted to work with me. But until he discovered endothelium-derived relaxing factor, there was nothing in common between the two of us, so we didn't work together.
Going back to the time, I remember that after the discovery of DRF by Furchgott, the interest was more for complex molecules. Then the surprise of this very simple molecule. Why your interest has been captured by simple molecules rather than complex molecules? Because at that time, the focus was on large molecules, not on simple ones.
It's a very simple answer to your question. Filippo, I have a simple mind. I cannot think complicated. No, but he goes deeper than that. And I'll make the story very short, but of course, this is a fascinating story. And sometimes for endothelium style meetings, I spend half hour on this, but I'll make it very short. When Bob discovered that acetylcholine relaxes arteries by an endothelium-dependent mechanism involving the production of endothelium-derived relaxing factor, or EDRF, he didn't know what EDRF was because it was so unstable. We immediately, it's a challenge. I have a passion for answering questions. I said, okay, he doesn't know what EDRF is, but we're going to figure out what it is. And we did. We had expertise with nitric oxide for years before that. By looking at his experiments and reproducing them in the lab, we were able to show that EDRF possessed literally identical chemical and pharmacological properties to nitric oxide. So in secret in my lab, we would say, my goodness, look here, EDRF may be nitric oxide. So we did a series of experiments to test this, to prove this, and when we got it all together, we published our key paper in 1986 at the Mayo Clinic, June 11th, 1986. You know, some dates you never forget. And we isolated, identified EDRF was nitric oxide. So we did get the help from Furchgott. If Furchgott had not discovered EDRF, we may never have discovered that the endothelium makes NO. That's the beauty of science and publishing all the work in different journals and making them totally accessible to all the researchers. Sometimes it takes a few brains to put together to come up with the answer.
Thank you. Very, very stimulating. Now, something lighter than science. In a previous dialogue, Göran Hansson told us that in the past few years, the first communication of the Nobel Award was by telephone. Was this the case in your case, and what was your reaction?
Oh, very good. No, it was not the case in my situation. You know, one thing that happens, the Nobel Committee meets on the last day, the day that the Nobel Prize is going to be announced. There are many members, I think 35. They sit around a round table and they have a series of votes. And they want to be sure that everyone has voted the same way each time. And once they tally the votes, then they open up the doors and allow the press to come in, and they announce the Nobel Prize. Nobody knows about the Nobel Prize before the doors are opened and the news media is told. However, before the doors are opened, the Nobel Committee with their staff, their secretarial staff, call each of the Nobel laureates to be and tell them in advance before the news media charges their lives. Well, I had moved from Malibu to Westwood and changed the phone number. I didn't tell them. Why would I tell them? I had no idea they were going to call me. So there's no phone number. They called friends. The friends didn't have the phone number. They called my wife, who had a phone number, but she was in the OR. She's an anesthesiologist. She was putting people to sleep to do brain aneurysm surgeries. And so they couldn't reach her. And so the Nobel Committee said, listen, we can't wait any longer. We're going to have to do this somehow. So they did it. They sent me an email. And I am the first Nobel laureate ever in history to be notified about the prize by email. And guess what? I had an email on my computer in my office at UCLA, but in those days, most people did not have cell phones. They were just being popular. So I did not have a cell phone with me. So the only time, the first time I heard about the Nobel Prize is from my Italian colleague who invited me to go to Napoli to give a talk based on something else. And when the plane landed on October 12th, 1998, he broke the news to me.
Fascinating story. Really, really unusual. Life sometimes is unpredictable.
Isn't that something? But the beautiful thing there was that my mom always reminded me when I went home. She said to me, Lou, or Luigi, you remember, you first heard about the Nobel Prize when you were in Napoli. Your father passed away many years ago, but you must remember that this is his hometown, and you heard about the Nobel Prize in Napoli. Therefore, God had something to do with this, and you must start going back to church on Sundays and thanking God. That was what my mother said to me.
Well, look, thank you. Not only you are a top scientist, but really you are a storyteller. It's fantastic the way you share with us your life. Really, really amazing. So one more personal question and then back to science. How did you celebrate the Nobel Prize?
Oh, okay. It's been 26 years since the Nobel Prize. And Filippo and the audience, I'm still celebrating. But how did I first start celebrating? Well, when I heard about the prize, I was on a plane on the way from Nice, where I went to a nitric oxide conference, to Napoli, a 45-minute drive. My friend Giuseppe Cirino invited me to give a talk to the pharmacy school in Naples. So while I was traveling, that's when the Nobel Prize was announced. Well, the Italians, Italy went crazy because of my name. They knew I was Italian. They thought maybe I was from Italy. They didn't realize I was an Italian, but living in the US. So there must have been 200 photographers waiting for me when the plane pulled up at the airport in Napoli. So I get off the plane and I look in front of me, and there must be hundreds of flashes going off from the camera. And I'm saying, what is going on here? So I turned around because I thought maybe the mayor of Campania or Napoli was there on the plane, and they were just taking his photo, but they were taking my photo. So I get to the edge of the steps on the bottom of the tarmac, and my friend Pippo, or Giuseppe, runs up to me and he says, Lou, have you heard the news? And I said, no, Pippo, what news? He says, here, read this. So he puts a piece of paper in front of me. It's written in Swedish. My Swedish is terrible, but I did notice one long word that started off Nobel, and then I didn't have to know the rest of the letters. And then I looked down and I saw my name. And that's when I first learned that I was awarded the Nobel Prize. So the mayor was there, the governor was there. There were so many politicians. They put me in a special limousine, and we had a motorcade from the airport to the center of Naples. It took 10 minutes. Normally, it takes 40 minutes, but with those cars, it took 10 minutes. They put me in a special hotel, the top floor, and above the floor was a big restaurant. So we celebrated with food, with champagne, with wine and even a little dancing, lots of TV cameras. So that was the first celebration. And let me tell you, it was a really special celebration because it was in Italia, in Napoli, where my father was born.
Fantastic. Now let's come back to science. After the discovery of NO, what was your next scientific challenge?
Well, let's see. The most important scientific challenge probably was what was I going to do next? I was so pleased with the work that I did. I answered a very important question to completion. But of course, the work on nitric oxide never ends. It just continues and continues. And so we decided to continue to investigate nitric oxide. But, I have to admit, the prize brought on many other accolades and awards, but more importantly, it allowed me to communicate in a much more expansive way to the rest of the world. I received so many invitations to go to so many different countries worldwide, globally, not just Europe, not just the US. I mean, this is the first time I made dozens of trips to China, Indonesia, Malaysia. I have been to Korea more than 50 times. I've been to Japan 55 times. I saved my travel folders, so I like to count the number of times I've been to these places. I was so happy doing all this work and receiving all this recognition that I phased down, my academic responsibilities and cut back on my research. I found that it was more challenging to work with others. So I collaborated with others, helped them plan experiments, helped them run their laboratories. And I still do that. And I really, really enjoy that, as opposed to having my own big research center.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm noting that in the audience, we have another top scientist who is also executive editor of the European Journal. It's Peter Libby. I don't know if you know each other personally, but Peter, comments on what we are discussing?
Hi, Peter. First of all, hi, Peter. I haven't seen you in ages.
So, Lou and I were part of the coterie of people who were interested in endothelial function way back when. And the late Paul von Hütte started a set of meetings that we held in Copper Mountain, which is a ski resort at altitude in Colorado. And was held during the summer when the rent was low. No one skis
right.
during the
and
summer.
The skiing was poor, right?
But there was great hiking, and you couldn't drink too much because you would be too much alcohol because you would be sick at that altitude. And so Lou, you and I got elected to run one of those once. Remember? So
right.
we
were
co-chairs of one of the mountain meetings on endothelial function. And then I don't remember what the occasion was, but we were in the Grand Hotel together for something. That's the hotel where they put you up when you win the Nobel Prize.
Oh, yes, in Stockholm, sure.
And the breakfast buffet there is terrific.
Isn't it? Oh, I love it. The Miranda right by the canals. Beautiful.
And I remember we were working out in the gym at the same time. So we've had a couple of
That's right.
But
you were always in good shape.
Having followed, well, you were on the treadmill looking. And of course, I remember once at a Gordon conference, you pointed out that a lot of the press releases when you won the Nobel Prize had to do with the relationship of nitric oxide and the erectile dysfunction drugs that were becoming available.
Yes. Yeah.
5 inhibitors. And
yes.
I can remember you making a comment during your talk saying, this is a problem that Italian men don't have.
Exactly, because I was asked by the audience, as having been instrumental in developing sildenafil or Viagra, I must ask you, Professor Ignarro, have you tried Viagra? Does it really work? And my answer would always be, well, you see, I've never tried it because being Italian, I don't have that problem. I don't think I offended anybody. You know, I always say, if you're Italian and you talk like that, how could you offend anybody?
No, I don't
Well,
think you offend anybody. Of course, I'm biased being Italian, but I don't think that you offend anybody. Lina, back to you.
yeah, yeah.
But Peter,
Okay.
it was great to see you again. You look fabulous.
Yep.
The idea here is that your work initiated a lot of research in many different laboratories around the world, right? So many groups have been working in cyclic GMP or in an NO. I mean, an NO synthase. Well, everything, how it's modulated, how cardiovascular risk factors modulate NO synthase. So what do you think, though, has been the most important clinical implication of the UR discovery, in your view?
In my view. Well, you know, I think there's so many, and it depends how you define clinical. We certainly have advanced, we meaning everybody working in the field, not just me, have advanced our understanding of the control of vascular function, blood flow, blood pressure, platelet aggregation, thrombosis, adherence of white blood cells and other cells onto the intimal lining that can lead to atherosclerosis, inflammation of the arteries, coronary artery disease, on and on and on. And knowing that nitric oxide is very protective against each and every one of those, I think provides incredibly important clinical implications. The next question comes, okay, based on that, how many drugs do we have in the market based on NO that can cure us of those conditions? And that's, you know, we don't have that many.
No.
And I think that the progress could be much better, but I'm a chemist and I can tell you that nitric oxide is a bear to work with. I mean, first of all, you know, two atoms bound together with a half-life of 3 seconds or less, highly diffusible, can't be stored in any organelles. It just reacts with everything, reacts with oxygen radicals. That's why it has a short duration of action. If it travels around and hits iron, reacts with sulfur, blah, blah, blah. Some of the reactions with sulfur, by the way, I think have great clinical applications, but that's a different subject.
Yeah.
It's been taking biotech companies and industry a while to try to figure out how to harness all of the advantages that nitric oxide has to offer. And, you know, if I was 20 years younger and at an active laboratory, that's where I would direct my efforts. It's not easy.
Yeah, we have here with us John Pieck. John, do you want to say something? He's working, has worked in this area also as well. John.
Well, it is an immense pleasure to hear the story about the discovery of nitric oxide. And my first question is, you already mentioned the short half-life. What was the problem with the discovery of nitric oxide in respect to the short half-life? How difficult it was to discover, and was it due to the short half-life of nitric oxide?
Yeah, it was a very short half-life. That's why when Bob first got discovered EDRF, he did a very interesting pharmacology experiment where he delayed, when the EDRF was released from a perfused artery, it was going to drip on a target artery to relax it. And the longer he made that trip in time, the less active EDRF was. So he calculated a half-life of about 3 seconds. Later, when we repeated it with nitric oxide, because that's when we thought that EDRF is nitric oxide, we came up with the same kind of a short half-life. So knowing the chemistry of NO, you can add certain chemical substances, certain sulfur-containing substances that tend to prolong the half-life of NO for up to a minute, let's say, while you're working with it experimentally. And that gave us enough time that we were able to use other procedures to react with the more stabilized NO and identify it spectrophotometrically as nitrosyl compounds, which can be made only by NO. It's very complicated, but we had to figure out a way to stabilize it a bit more. But the thing is, if nobody had the clue that EDRF might be NO, I don't think anybody would have ever stabilized EDRF, or maybe later we're using a totally different rationale.
Right. So
Maybe could I ask maybe one more question, maybe short?
yes, please go ahead.
It is about what, as an outsider, my question is from an outsider. So what was actually the role of Moncada? Has always been quoted quite often, but what was the role of Moncada in the discovery of nitric oxide?
Okay, so I get asked this once in a while, and I always try to be
Polite.
very careful and very polite. No, because I like Salvador. I've been his friend for a long time. But he flies off the handle sometimes, and he gets mad, he gets jealous. Let me answer that question by saying this, sir, please. There are two criteria for the Nobel Prize in Medicine set forth by the Nobel Foundation, actually set forth by Alfred Nobel in his 1896 will. Here are the two criteria. One, there has to be a novel, original, first-time discovery. And two, that discovery has to be shown to have great benefit to humankind. It's not just a discovery, okay? But the discovery, has to be an original, first-time discovery. When we were doing our work, we were the first to show in 1986 that our endothelial cells make nitric oxide. I presented that at a meeting on June 11th at the Mayo Clinic, and that means it's published, because it's in the abstract book. It's in the book of publications. Raven Press, an old publication house, was supposed to publish that within months. It took them 2 years to publish. They ran into financial difficulty. Salvador Moncada was at my meeting. It was an endothelial meeting at the Mayo Clinic. He heard me give a talk showing that EDRF is NO. During the discussion, he ran out of the room. I saw him run out. I thought he was so excited he had to go to the bathroom or something. I didn't know. He ran out. Later, I found that he called his colleague, Richard Palmer, in the laboratory and said, look, Ignarro says EDRF is NO. I want you to set up those experiments. We got to do this as quickly as possible and publish this as quickly as possible. And he published it a couple of months before we did in Nature.
Okay.
However, we submitted our work to PNAS and CERP Research before that paper appeared. The Nobel Foundation, I have the greatest respect for. They did their homework. They told Salvador, because Salvador complained. They said, Salvador, the Ignarro group presented all of this evidence in 1986 before your eyes when you didn't even know it. Presenting at meetings counts just as much as a publication in a journal. That's what iced it. And that's why I, was awarded the prize. Salvador was great researcher, very smart. He did more to advance the field of nitric oxide than anybody I know in the 1980s. But you see, the prize is not given to those who advance a field. It's given to those who discover the field.
Okay.
And Salvador got many different awards for advancing the field, but not for discovering it in the first place. That's the politest way I could answer that question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for sharing this. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So we should move on. So after receiving the Nobel, you have received many other awards, many. If I read your CV, I will spend the whole hour. So the point is, what is, of those that you got afterwards, what is the one that you are more proud of or you like better?
Well, I don't like any better, that's for sure.
No, no, of the rest.
Okay, no, I understand. I understand. Right at the same time that the Nobel Prize was announced, there was another prize announced, and that was the Basic Research Prize of the American Heart Association in recognition of outstanding contributions to the advancement of cardiovascular science. That comes from the American Heart Association. That brought tears to my eyes. When I received that one, I knew that my career was set. Okay, so I heard that first, a couple of months. So I was celebrating with that. I was so happy. I had to go to Dallas to receive that prize. Okay, just before I left to go to Dallas to receive that prize, the Nobel Committee announces the Nobel Prize. So here I have the two prizes together. You know, something I could never forget. So I sort of hold them all in equal. You know, I mean, I had American Heart Association grants and did publications on those journals for decades. So to be honored by the American Heart Association was incredible. How could I, you know,
Yeah.
how could I say that? So those two were the big awards. Afterwards, there were a number of different awards that I received. One I wouldn't like to tell you about because, you know, it's not as prestigious in science as the other awards, but among celebrities is very nice. Back in, I think it was 2015, 2018, I don't remember, I received a special award for my contributions to humanity. This is what they said. This was the Golden Plate Award, which is given mainly in California. And I shared this special award, and it was for contributions to humanity. I already mentioned that. So I shared this this award with notable celebrities, including the news announcer Wolf Blitzer. I'm sure you've heard of
Yeah.
Sanjay Gupta, who was very popular. But then over to the entertainment side, remember, I'm from Hollywood. I shared the prize with Carol Burnett, who
Oh, yeah.
was a tremendous comedian. And my favorite female vocalist was Diana Ross
Ah,
of the Supremes. And so
yeah.
with
Good
her,
finger.
I even danced with her at
Did
this
you?
conference.
Oh.
Oh yeah. Oh, she's my age, and let me tell you, she puts me to shame. So, you know, those are fun awards. You know, there are scientific awards, and then there are fun awards. And I have to tell you, I enjoy the fun awards.
Okay, that's good. You enjoy life. This is important. Also, it goes with being Italian also, huh? Enjoying life. That's important. So let me ask you something about, because you have traveled a lot. So what about science in the US and in Europe? Do you see major differences in the approach to science in the two continents? I mean,
Well, you know,
we can talk
yeah.
about years before and now, presently.
Yeah, I think it may be improving a little bit now. You know, I never paid that much attention to anything but the American way because I had to learn how to write grants and to do the appropriate things, the correct things to approach science in the US. And what I noticed in the American system is that it offers so many opportunities for young investigators to study anything their heart desires. You know, they're not, you know, it's very competitive, but it's very fair. There's not that much regulation. At least back then, there wasn't that much regulation. The NIH doesn't come out and say, well, you know, we have cancer, we have to cure cancer, therefore we're going to throw all the money into the cancer basket. And you folks working on cardiovascular problems, we're not going to give you a lot of money. That does not happen in the US. Maybe now it's happening a little bit, but certainly didn't back then. Whereas I noticed that in Europe often follows a more centralized approach in regulation. whereas the US leans more in a decentralized government. My European colleagues, I have so many in Italia, so many in Germany, and Sweden. They tell me that there's more freedom in the US to conduct basic research in whatever area interests them, whereas that's not always the case in Europe. Now, I could be wrong. I'm just telling you what they told me. I've never worked in Europe. I've never applied for grants in Europe, so I do not know from personal experience.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's partly true. I spent years in the United States, and it's true that the opportunities are very, very high there. At least they were when I was there. I hope they keep being as well a lot of opportunities, as it says, right? In Europe, we're doing better. This is true, but it's also true what you say, that we have a control, government control. You know, it goes too low, too down. I mean, in a hospital, in universities, but nevertheless, we're getting better. So now, I'm going to get used of having you here. So can you share with us 3 simple things that we could do to improve our own health by boosting NO production? 3.
I'm so happy to do that. In fact, I have written books for the general public on this. I have another one, which I'm looking for a publisher now. It's called The Miracle Molecule of Health and Longevity, and it's all about nitric oxide and what you could do to boost the production of your nitric oxide. You know, the key thing I want to do is make nitric oxide a household word. So few people know what nitric oxide is, but yet 99% of the people know what Viagra is. This sometimes gets to be frustrating for me. And so I think the 3 simple things you can do, which most people do not believe when I talk, because everybody's looking for a magic bullet drug, which does not exist. Maybe Ozempic to some extent, but I won't get into that. But to make a long story short, healthy, balanced nutrition, similar to the old-fashioned Mediterranean style. That's number 1. Number 2, physical activity. One of the most important ways our bodies produce nitric oxide is by physical activity. The more activity, the more NO, but you don't have to overwork yourself, because simple walking for 30 or 40 minutes a day at a brisk pace, not jogging or running, just walking at a brisk pace. If you do that for 30, 40 minutes a day, 3 or 4 days a week, that has been shown clinically, and it's been published by the US government, to reduce all-cause mortality. And that's all you have to know. And it works. It works. Now, there's a third method that I have to push. I pushed this a couple of years ago. We published some work in the British Journal of Pharmacology, and that is breathing through your nose, inhaling through your nose. A Swedish group, 2 good friends of mine, showed that your nasal mucosa produce lots of nitric oxide gas. Your mouth does not, but your nasal mucosa
I'm doing it now.
produces nitric oxide. So if you inhale through your nose, you bring in the NO into your lungs. What does NO do? 3 main things. 1, bronchodilator. It dilates the airways. More air, therefore more oxygen into the lungs. NO is a vasodilator. So you can supply blood to those regions that are getting more oxygen by the alveoli. And the third one, which is incredible, NO is a fantastic antiviral chemical. And many people believe that the NO that your nose makes protects you from getting a variety of virally induced respiratory problems like the common cold, maybe the flu. And you know why we know that? Because a couple of years ago, in an experimental series run by the Massachusetts General Hospital and then spread to other clinics, inhaled nitric oxide gas was used highly successfully to treat COVID-19 in patients with serious problems and kept them out of the ICU in order to free up the beds for other patients. And one of the first studies, there was about a dozen female patients who were pregnant, who had serious COVID. Through approval by the FDA, by the Massachusetts General Hospital staff, and so on, these women were given inhaled nitric oxide, starting with low concentration, building up. And to make a long story short, they all left the hospital. They were cured of COVID. And every one of the pregnant ladies gave birth to perfectly normal babies. And I rest my case. I mean, so I try whenever I can to breathe in through my nose. I take advantage of scientific discoveries.
That's cheap, huh? It's a cheap.
It's cheap.
And without side effects.
So Albert Wigman is here. Do you want to say anything? Because you're following it very, very lively. Albert, you're mute now.
At first, I had to disagree that when young people nowadays are curious and make bombs, they don't end up with the Nobel Prize, but they end in jail. So, but the nitric oxide on cholesterol and the dysfunction of the endothelium. Can you tell more about that?
Yeah, well, of course, it's the dysfunction of the endothelium that is the root of evil for so many of the cardiovascular diseases. And I believe that we understand that better now because the endothelial cells are the only cells in the vasculature that produce nitric oxide. So if you have endothelial dysfunction, you make less NO. Okay, why is that important? Well, look what NO does. NO balances your blood pressure, regulates, controls blood pressure. It keeps the blood pressure from going too high, perhaps, preventing, at least acutely, hypertension. Nitric oxide is an incredible inhibitor of platelet adhesion onto the intima. It inhibits platelet aggregation, stickiness, prevents local blood clotting. Maybe this is important in preventing thrombosis and stroke and myocardial infarction. NO is a spectacular anti-inflammatory drug. So it could fight the pro-inflammatory cytokines and other things released from inflammatory cells like white blood cells or macrophage-like cells that are trying to permeate the intimal lining to get into the medial layer containing the smooth muscle cells. So NO does all these good things. So therefore, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to conclude that if you have endothelial dysfunction, you're going to limit all of those protective effects of nitric oxide. And, I believe that's true until we find a better answer for endothelial dysfunction. I think this is a good one to keep with for a while.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to pass the word to Filippo because we are really running out of time. This is so nice and so joyful that we didn't realize the time was going passing. Filippo, please.
Well, one final question from the audience, from science back to mentorship. Dr. Crea is a young colleague, and the question is, which skills are needed for a young researcher to become an independent researcher? Not an easy question.
I think that we use the word curious at the beginning. I think it's very important to be curious. It's important to want to answer questions in biology. Let's say biomedicine. Okay, that's the field we're talking about. It's important to understand the important questions in medical biology that have not yet been answered and try to learn more about those conditions and answer those questions. What many young investigators do is they've learned something in school or a postdoc. They see what somebody else does. They follow in their footsteps to try to do a better job. And maybe they could discover something. Is that a good approach? I don't know. I never did that approach. I never wanted to do the same thing anybody else was doing. My mentor in graduate school would always say, but Lou, to start with, you've got to do what other people do. You have to see if you can reproduce the work, do what they do, follow in their footsteps, and then you'll be able to, go to the outside and think of other things to do and ask important questions. But I'm Italian. I am impatient. My patience does not last long. So many times I have an idea that I want to explore something. I've already talked to you about nitroglycerin, explosive. It has a nitro group. How is this a vasodilator? Maybe this could help us understand vasodilation. That led to nitric oxide. Then we discovered nitric oxide as a neurotransmitter. Okay, how will this help diseases affected by neurotransmitter deficiency? That's how we made it possible for Pfizer to discover sildenafil and Viagra. So, maybe I should say it this way. I like to think outside the box. Sometimes it's not successful, but sometimes it's more successful. It's a little risky because if you're thinking outside the box, you probably don't have any money to support the outside the box research. But I remember a quote from a very famous writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." I love that quote. I'm sorry. It's corny maybe, but I love it. And that's how I have practiced my profession.
Good.
Well, yeah, to summarize, I think we can tell our young colleague that he can become independent when, among the many questions which flood this fertile mind, is able to identify the important questions. Not all questions which come to your mind are important. To be innovative, you must identify the priorities, the important questions. Now, Lou, I have a last question from my side. I ask all our guests, what are your suggestions to improve our dialogues?
Well, I think you've done such an outstanding job with these dialogues. This is such an important way to get information to everybody who wants to participate, in these kind of dialogues. Now, the EHJ, the European Heart Journal, signifies heart and cardiovascular physiology. I suppose that's going to be the topic that you would always want to have, or topics relevant to that. But, it does not always have to be purely clinical in nature. You've mixed it up today. We have a clinical nature, we have basic in nature, and I like the idea that you have in getting more personally involved with the investigator. It's always good to try to connect or see, look at the successful investigators and then listen to their life story and try to draw conclusions as to, did one have anything to do with the other? But I've thought about people who might be able to if that's what you were looking for, I'm not sure. But if you're looking for people who might give a good EHJ dialogue based on their research and based on their personality and way to speak, there are two guys that come to mind. One is Bill Sessa, who's Italian, from Yale University, and the other one is Thomas Michel, who's not Italian, from Harvard University. Both men have made contributions to vascular physiology, especially endothelial cell function, which is a very important part, of cardiovascular function. And they have great stories to share.
I like the classification of the world as Italian or non-Italian. That's good.
Well, hey, what can I tell you?
It has been really a fascinating dialogue. Let's celebrate this fascinating dialogue. And in Italy, we like toast. We like a glass of champagne and we like to make a toast. Which toast do you propose to finish?
Oh, I think that, if it was up to me, let's see, you kind of put me on the spot. I would think that we really need to thank all of the clinical and basic research investigators who have made life-saving contributions to advancing our understanding of cardiovascular disease and developing new ways to treat our patients, especially the elderly patients. I think we've done a great job with that over the last decades, and we could certainly improve. So that's my toast.
Okay.
Yeah, in Italy, we also say per cent'anni, which
Oh,
means
yes.
let's continue for 100 years.
Yes.
Lou and Lina
Agree with
and all
that.
of you, thank you very much for this
Thank
wonderful
you.
hour, wonderful dialogue. And let me announce the next dialogue will be, as usual, on the last Thursday of the month, will be on May the 30th at 17 CET. And our next guest will be Deepak Bhatt from New York. Thank you
Yes.
very much.
Okay,
And
thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Great
Thank you
pleasure,
very
Luke.
much, all of you.
Great
Bye-bye.
pleasure.
Thank you for the honor. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye, everybody.